You're standing in the break room, and everyone around you is talking about the game last night. Someone throws a stat at you like it's a password to a club you never joined. You nod, you smile, you say something vague, and you feel that tiny click of being on the outside of a conversation that isn't really about football at all. Somebody eventually asks the question, half joking, half suspicious. Wait, you don't watch football? And the way they ask it, you'd think you just admitted to disliking puppies. There's this quiet assumption that not watching football means something is missing in you, like you skipped a chapter everyone else got in childhood. But what if the real story isn't about missing anything at all? What if the people who never got into football aren't disconnected from something normal, but connected to something else entirely, something quieter and less talked about? Maybe the reason has nothing to do with sports at all, and everything to do with how a person's brain learned to find safety, meaning, and belonging. Psychologists have actually spent a surprising amount of time studying why some people bond intensely with group rituals, while others opt out, often without even deciding to. Some of that research comes from studying sports fandom directly, but a lot of it comes from broader work on belonging, threat detection, and how children learn what's safe to get excited about. None of it points to a single tidy explanation, which is honestly more interesting than if it did, because it means your particular reason is probably layered rather than simple. It turns out there isn't just one reason someone skips the Sunday ritual. There are several distinct psychological paths that all lead to the same quiet result, an empty seat on the couch during kickoff. Some of these paths come from how a nervous system processes group excitement. Some come from childhood associations nobody consciously remembers, and some come from a completely different relationship with identity and belonging. You might see yourself in one of these, or maybe pieces of two or three, and either way, none of them are about being broken or antisocial. Let's start with the version of this that shows up most in casual conversation. The person everyone assumes is just not a sports person. Picture someone at a Super Bowl party, sitting slightly outside the main cluster of chairs, present but noticeably unmoved by the chaos on screen. When the room erupts after a touchdown, this person claps a beat late, like they're following stage directions rather than feeling anything. Nobody in that room is judging harshly, but there's a subtle sense that this person is performing enthusiasm rather than living it. Psychologists call this a difference in what's known as crowd contagion, the tendency for emotion to spread rapidly through a group based on shared attention and synchronized arousal. Some brains are simply wired with a lower baseline response to synchronized crowd energy, meaning the roar of a stadium crowd on TV doesn't trigger the same dopamine spike it does for someone sitting right next to them. This isn't a flaw in the nervous system, it's closer to a different calibration, the same way some people cry at movies and others just don't.
Think about a time you were the only person not laughing at a joke that had everyone else in tears, not because you didn't understand it, but because your emotional timing just runs on a different clock. That's essentially what's happening during a football game for this kind of person. The emotional wave is happening, but it's arriving late or muted, like watching fireworks through a window. There's a reason this matters more than it sounds like it should, because people often mistake a muted emotional response for a lack of caring altogether, and that mistake can quietly follow someone for years. A person with this wiring might have spent their whole life being called hard to read or too calm, when really their internal experience just moves on a slower, quieter frequency than the room around them. There's already something else worth sitting with here, because this isn't really about football at all. It's about how differently people experience shared excitement. But there's a second kind of person who avoids football for a completely different reason, one that has almost nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with control. This person can tell you the score of a game, they understand the rules perfectly well, and they've simply decided somewhere along the way that watching isn't worth the emotional investment. Picture someone glancing at their phone during the game, checking in occasionally, but never fully surrendering their attention to the outcome. When their friend jumps up screaming after a last-second win, this person smiles politely and goes back to their book. There's a concept in motivation psychology called locus of control, which describes how much a person believes outcomes depend on their own actions versus outside forces. People with a strong internal locus of control often feel unsettled watching an event they have zero influence over because their psychological comfort comes from agency, not spectatorship. Watching millionaires compete over a ball with an outcome you can't affect no matter how hard you yell at the screen can feel less like entertainment and more like surrendering your evening to randomness. I remember sitting through a game with my cousin's family years ago, and every time the crowd gasped, I felt this strange low-level irritation I couldn't quite explain at the time. It wasn't boredom exactly, it was more like my brain kept asking why I was emotionally invested in something I had absolutely no say in. Later, I realized that feeling wasn't really about football. It was about how uncomfortable I get whenever I'm asked to care about outcomes I can't influence in any way. That's the quiet psychological engine running under this second profile, and it explains why some of the smartest, most driven people you know skip the game entirely. You'll often find this person deep into strategy games, personal projects, or hobbies where their effort directly shapes the result, because that connection between action and outcome is where their satisfaction actually lives. Watching two teams they have no stake in fight over a ball just doesn't scratch that same itch, no matter how skillfully the game is played. It's worth noticing that this isn't a lack of passion, it's passion redirected toward things that actually respond to their input. There's another layer to this, though, because control isn't the only thing pulling people away from the screen.
Let's talk about a third kind of person. The one whose disinterest in football isn't really about football at all, but about an old wound wearing a new disguise. Picture a child sitting on the living room floor while a parent screams at a television, not in celebration, but in fury, slamming a hand on the coffee table after a bad call. That child learns, without any words being spoken, that this ritual comes with unpredictable danger hiding inside excitement. Attachment psychology talks about how children build internal models of safety based on repeated emotional patterns in the home, and repeated exposure to unpredictable anger during a specific activity can quietly wire that activity to anxiety for life. This isn't a conscious memory most of the time. It's closer to a felt sense, a tightening in the chest whenever the volume of a crowd gets too loud on a screen. Years later, this person avoids football parties, not because they dislike sports, but because their nervous system has quietly filed football under unsafe. Think about the last time you avoided a certain song, restaurant, or smell without fully understanding why, and you already understand exactly how this kind of avoidance works. It's rarely a decision. It's a pattern that runs underneath decisions, showing up as disinterest when it's actually protection. This is where the story gets a little heavier, because underneath a lot of casual avoidance is something more tender than people expect. I think about my own childhood sometimes, watching my father get quietly furious during games. Not violent, just cold and distant in a way that made the whole house feel smaller. I didn't hate football as a kid. I just learned that Sunday afternoons could turn tense without warning, and my body started bracing before I even understood why. It took me years to separate the sport itself from the emotional weather it used to predict in my house. That's the strange thing about avoidance. It rarely announces itself as fear. It just shows up quietly, dressed as indifference. Neuroscience actually backs this up in a fascinating way, because the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, doesn't need conscious memory to keep flagging something as risky. It just needs a pattern, repeated enough times, and it will keep sounding a quiet alarm decades after the original danger disappeared. So when someone says, "I've just never been into football," there might be an entire emotional history compressed into that one casual sentence. What makes this profile especially tricky is that it rarely gets recognized, even by the person living inside it, because the discomfort shows up as mild boredom rather than obvious distress. Nobody sits down at a party and thinks, "I'm avoiding this because of my childhood." They just quietly find a reason to be in the kitchen when the game gets loud. And yet, none of this means the person is damaged or overly sensitive. It means their brain did exactly what brains are built to do: protect first, enjoy later. There's a fourth kind of person too, one that doesn't come from fear or control, but from identity, a much less discussed but equally powerful psychological force. This person didn't grow up with football as a family ritual, didn't build friendships around Sunday games, and simply never had the cultural scaffolding that makes fandom feel natural. Picture someone who grew up moving between countries, or in a household where soccer, or nothing at all, filled the role football fills for other families. For this person, football isn't emotionally loaded, it's just culturally unfamiliar, like a language they never had reason to learn fluently. Social identity theory explains how deeply humans tie their sense of self to group belonging, and fandom is one of the most accessible forms of that belonging in modern life. But if you never got the early exposure that turns a sport into a piece of your identity, there's no emotional shortcut pulling you toward the screen later in life. It's not resistance, it's simply the absence of an early groove that would have made this ritual feel automatic.
Think about how strange it would feel to be handed a favorite childhood cartoon from someone else's country, one you never grew up with, and be expected to feel the same nostalgia they do watching it now as adults. That's roughly what football night can feel like for someone who missed the years when the ritual usually gets wired into a person's sense of belonging. There's nothing to fix here either, because belonging can always be built later in life. It just doesn't arrive automatically the way it does for people who grew up inside the tradition. This is where you might be sitting there thinking about your own reasons, wondering which of these versions sounds closest to your actual experience. Maybe it's the muted emotional response. Maybe it's the need for control. Maybe it's an old family tension. Or maybe it's simply a groove that never got carved. Here's a question worth sitting with instead of rushing past. Is your distance from football really about football, or is it about something your nervous system decided long before you had the words for it? Is it freedom from a ritual that never fit you, or is it protection built quietly around a memory you'd rather not revisit? Have you actually made peace with not watching, or did you just stop expecting yourself to enjoy something you were once made to feel wrong for avoiding? There's no need to answer that out loud, and honestly, the question matters more than any answer you could rush to give it. What's worth remembering through all of this is that none of these reasons make someone antisocial, cold, or somehow less connected to other people. Different nervous systems respond to synchronized crowd energy differently, and that's not a personality flaw. It's just neurological variation, the same as differences in humor or taste in music. Needing agency over outcomes you invest in emotionally isn't stubbornness. It's a coherent psychological preference that shows up in plenty of areas beyond sports. Carrying an old association between loud rooms and unpredictable tension isn't weakness. It's a nervous system doing its job a little too well, a little too long after it needed to. And never building an early bond with a sport isn't a gap in your personality. It's simply a different cultural path that shaped what feels familiar to you. It's easy to internalize years of playful teasing about being no fun or not a real fan of anything until you start believing something is actually missing in you. But the truth underneath all of this is far less dramatic and far more human than that story you've been telling yourself. Your nervous system simply made a series of quiet decisions about what deserves your full attention, long before you were old enough to argue with it. You don't owe anyone an explanation for the seat you choose during a Super Bowl party, whether that seat is right in the middle of the noise or quietly near the door. If any part of this made you think of your own living room growing up, or your own quiet discomfort during a crowded, loud celebration, sit with that feeling for a moment before moving on. Notice where it shows up in your body. Notice whether it feels like boredom, tension, or something older trying to get your attention. You don't have to change anything about how you spend your Sundays because of what you just heard, but understanding why you drift away from a ritual everyone else seems to love can quietly change how you talk to yourself about it. Maybe you'll bring it up with someone close to you, or maybe you'll just carry it quietly the next time a game comes on and everyone around you leans in. Either way, you'll probably notice the moment differently now, less like proof that something is missing and more like a small window into how your mind learned to protect and prioritize what matters to you. If this resonated with you in a way you didn't expect, let it sit for a while before you decide what to do with it. And if you want to keep exploring the quieter reasons behind the things that make you feel like the odd one out, there's a lot more of this conversation still waiting.